Hi class. We are starting our final week of Unit 4 on genetics and the inheritance of traits from parents to offspring. And this week we are going to focus on exceptions to the rule. So we have been talking the past week or so about dominant and recessive traits and sort of assuming an inheritance that one gene equals one trait, but that's not really how it goes. And this is what you read about in the article at the start of the unit on oversimplifying genetics. Um, More times than not, there's a lot of different genes that code for a bunch of proteins that are all involved in different steps along the way where these proteins work together to form specific traits. And so it is more complicated than one gene to one trait. There's usually lots of different genes interacting to shape who we are and what we look like. Okay. Our first exception to the rule is called incomplete dominance, and incomplete dominance refers to a time that a dominant allele actually doesn't completely cover up the recessive. Instead, the two alleles more so blend if it is a heterozygous genotype. And you can think of this sort of like the mixing of paint. A great example of incomplete dominance is the inheritance of color in flowers like snapdragons. And so what we see here is that the homozygous dominant parent has a red phenotype, and the homozygous recessive parent has a white phenotype. But when they pass down those alleles to their offspring to form a zygote offspring, the phenotype is actually pink. So that's where we see this incomplete dominance, that the red is not completely covering up the white, but it's more blending together. And then what happens here is if we crossed two heterozygous plants together, you would end up with 25% red offspring, 50% pink, and 25% white. The second type of exceptions to the rule is called codominance, and this means that there are multiple alleles, or both alleles are dominant alleles, and that means both are expressed if they are present. The weird thing about this is it means that even though it's the same gene loci, there are two different capital letters used to represent that gene, and that's because both are dominant. So a great example is in the coloration of a lot of different animals. Horses could be one example. And for horse coloration, we could say, okay, a capital B means the horse is brown, and a capital W means the horse is white. And so these are the genotypes of a horse with that brown fur. And here's the genotype of the horse with the white. And if you cross those two, parents, you'll end up with capital B, capital W for 100% of the offspring. And you end up with a horse kind of like this, where they didn't blend together, but both are being completely expressed on different areas of the horse. Okay, the third type is called multiple alleles. What this means is there's more than just two variations of a specific gene trait. Um, So there can be dominant and recessive, but there might be multiple, not just two options for these different alleles. The most common example of a multiple allele trait is your blood type. Our blood type is really important to how our blood fights off diseases and recognizes antibodies. But there are 4 different types, blood types that different people have. You can be type A, type B, type AB, or type O. So maybe you could ask your parent if you don't know what type of blood that you have. But the way that this works when we talk about a genetics problem is that there are 3 possible alleles for blood type. There's a dominant A allele, there's a dominant B allele, and there's a recessive allele that leads to an O type blood. Okay? When you have type A blood, your genotype can either be homozygous dominant, capital A, or heterozygous, capital A, I. If you're type B blood, you could have a homozygous dominant type, capital B, or you could have a heterozygous genotype. If you have type O blood, you are homozygous recessive. And if you have type AB blood, it's kind of like a codominant trait. You have a capital A and a capital B. So we can use this to predict the possible blood types of offspring from parents. So let's say that there is a cross between type A blood and type B blood, but both individuals are heterozygous, so they also carry that I allele. Then, complete the Punnett square here. You could get 25% AB blood, you could get 25% B blood, 25% A blood, and 25% O type blood. Okay? Now let's try another one of these problems. Lauren has type A blood, but her mother has type B blood, and she marries Ken, who has type O blood. What percent of their offspring will have O type blood? Okay, so let me talk you through this. If Lauren's type A and her mother is type B, then the only thing that her mother could have passed down to her is the lowercase I allele, because she can't pass down that B allele, or Lauren would be A or AB blood type. So we know Lauren's mother must have been a heterozygous, capital BI, and she passed down the I allele to Lauren, and Lauren must have gotten the A allele from her father. So Lauren's blood type is capital AI. And she marries Ken, who has type O, so that means he's lowercase I, lowercase I. And if we cross those two, so this is Lauren here at the top, those are her alleles. These are Ken's alleles. You'll end up with 50% of their offspring will have type A blood, and 50% of their offspring could have type B blood. Sorry, not type B, type O blood. II codes for O type blood. Okay, so we started this unit talking a little bit about plants, and we used the example of plants in the first lecture to think about a tall trait versus a short trait. In human beings, obviously, this is a little more complicated. A tall person that mates with a short person, that doesn't mean that all of the offspring are going to be tall because it's dominant. Instead, it's more likely that the offspring would have a height somewhere in the middle. And the reason for that is because of polygenic inheritance. This is the most important form of complex genetics that I want you to remember. Poly means many. So polygenic means that there's many genes that affect a single trait. And this is like the heart of how genetics works. In most cases, many genes affect a single trait. Common examples of polygenic traits, though, are those that have a lot of different ranges of phenotypes. So some perfect examples are eye color, hair color, height, all of the skin color, all of these, there's a spectrum from low to high of shades or heights, and that's because there's not one gene that affects them. There's multiple genes. We can see in this picture here that's showing skin color that they're representing skin color with 3 genes. It's actually more than that. But the more dominants there are, the darker the skin color, the more recessives alleles there are, the lighter the skin color. And it's like kind of like all of those different dominant and recessive alleles are added together to create a total shade of skin color. Obviously, middle tones across an entire population are the most common because it's more likely that you would have kind of a mixture of dominant and recessive alleles. Really dark skin or really light skin are less common overall. And same idea here with eye color. So you can see over here the completely dominant eye shade is the darkest. The ones that are completely recessive are the lightest, and more likely it's a mixture somewhere in the middle of various genes acting together. Okay. This is kind of polygenic again, representing height. And the shortest individuals are the ones that have the most recessive alleles at all 3 different genes. And the more dominance you add, the taller the person is. Skin color is influenced by 3 major genes. Dominant genes cause greater production of melanin. Which of the following would be the genotype for a darker skin phenotype? You would count up the capital letters. The more dominance, the darker the skin. So the first one has 1, 2, 3 capitals. Second one has 1. Last one has 1, 2, 3, 4. So the darkest skin shade would be this person with the most dominant alleles here at the bottom. Okay, and sex-linked traits. This is also really an important category. A sex-linked trait means that the gene that we are considering or thinking about is on the chromosome that affects the sex, the biological sex of the organism. So I think we touched on this briefly last unit, but females have 2 X chromosomes for their sex chromosomes, and males have an X chromosome, but then they don't have a second X chromosome. They have a Y. This is at the 23rd chromosome pairing in all of our cells, our sex chromosomes, and females always have XX, males always have XY. Because it's a chromosome, it has lots of genes on it. So all of the genes on this X chromosome are not connected to sex necessarily. There's also other genes that can be found on that X chromosome. One being color blindedness. Okay, so color blindedness is more common in males. The reason for that is because they only need one recessive allele for color blindedness to express the colorblind trait. And that's because they don't have a second X chromosome. They only have a Y. For females to be colorblind, just like other traits, they have to have both recessive alleles. So it's less likely for that to happen where they would get a recessive allele from both of their parents. If we look at a sex-linked problem, here's an example here. A man with normal vision, so that means his X chromosome is a dominant allele, but then he doesn't have another X chromosome, he has a Y because he's male. And his wife has normal vision, that means she has to have at least one capital N, but it says that the wife's mom was colorblind. That means the mom could have only passed down a lowercase n. So that's why we have X lowercase n down here. That's the allele that the wife got from her mom. So we have a heterozygous woman and a dominant male, and if you cross them, you're going to end up with the following genotypes listed here. Now the 2 on the left, those are female offspring because they're XX, and both of the female offspring would have normal vision because one is homozygous dominant and one is heterozygous, and color blindness is a recessive trait. But if you look at the male offspring, the XYs, 50% of the male offspring or 25% of the total offspring would be colorblind because they have that lowercase n listed there. Okay, so sex-linked traits are really important. They